So within BirdLife, we try to work on the protection of the species and the sites important for the species within the African Eurasian flyway and beyond, of course. But we, as BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, we focus on the African Eurasian flyway. And we have an initiative on the western part, so the East Atlantic flyway. But we're building now a bit capacity and cooperation among the countries, the partners there, and other organizations on the eastern part of the African region flyway. So generally from Finland to Turkey, way down to South Africa. So this is one of a series of webinars on water birds, trying to look at which issues are threatening some of these species, and we want to use them as a bit of a flagship species to identify which sites are important for water birds, what we need to do there, and also through them strengthen the cooperations and the exchange of information on those species, but also more generally on the threats they face. We've chosen the ducks and the diving ducks in particular to start with, mainly because our friends from BSPB are working already some time on this species and also trying to develop a live project. But for sure, Nikki will tell more about that. So we thought this is really a good start to start a webinar on these species, because even with although they're quite different and a lot of them are only using a part of the African Eurasian flyway. They are for us examples of the species where we can go more in detail on the threats, because as we hopefully will further discover, they have common needs, so we can really use them to improve their protection. But as said, we really want to go beyond this, beyond these specific individual species, but they will hopefully teach us which way we can go. So thank you very much for attending this meeting. We are recording this, and we will also keep you informed of the next meetings when they will happen. For a lot of you, you're so lucky to go into the field and do some field work. It's raining and windy here today, so anyway, it wouldn't be a good day to go and look for birds. But thanks very much for the effort you make to be here, and hopefully we'll get a lot of feedback from you in the discussion later on. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks a lot, Wim. I love the concept of the flagship species also for communication, so it's really nice. Nikki, your turn.
Thank you. So yes, as Wim has said, we've been working for a while to set up a wider project looking along the flyway for these three particular species that diving ducks that we are focusing on today. We would start with this first webinar talking more about the specific species and have the pleasure to have speakers who are quite in depth of these in the topic. The first presenter will be Andy Green, who has been working for ages probably on wetlands and water birds and has done a lot on white-headed duck. Probably knows more than anyone else on the species. Pleasure to have Tony Fox as a speaker who will talk about the common pochard. One of the other speakers we have invited, our colleague from Turkey, Omral Özkoç, who has been serving these 3 species actually for over 2 years within Turkey, which is quite an important country for all the species, being breeding, migratory, and wintering territory for them. And yeah, myself will be one of the other speakers speaking about one of my favorite species. So yeah, we can start giving the floor to Andy.
Okay, well, I'm starting before time, but that's fine. I hope I won't ramble on too much. I've probably got too many slides for 15 minutes, but I'll try and keep to the point. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not sure I'm worthy of such fine words from Nikki, but I will do my best to I'll do my best to provide some useful insights based on my experience with white-headed ducks. Is that okay, the screen? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, let's see. So why am I not, why is it moving? Okay, for some reason it's not moving when I, oh, there we go. Okay, we're on. We're on. I'll just move these photos of you nice people out of the way. Okay, so really I started to work with the white-headed ducks when I joined the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust in 1989. And at that point, the first international action plan for, I think, for any species from IWRB, or at least for any of the globally threatened species, had just been produced by a colleague who'd just left, Simon Unstay, and part of my job was basically, I was asked to do all the follow-up and work on the implementation and keep on top of the status of the species. We subsequently produced an update together a few years later, and then I was working on white-headed ducks quite intensively during that period while I was at the trust. And then I moved to here in Andalusia, originally in 1993 with a 1-year postdoc, originally to work on marble teal because I'd also just produced an action plan for that species. And I realized that one of the big questions was the lack of work on the ecology of the species. So really I've worked a lot more over the years on marble teal than I have on white-headed duck in terms of the time I've spent studying them in the field. Anyway, since then I've been here and I've been working on many different questions, and not just globally threatened waterfowl. I work on lots of other water birds and also lots of other questions in terms of invasions of other organisms, for example, or wetland restoration. And so, well, you can find me on Google Scholar if you're interested in the work I'm doing these days. So actually the most recent thing I did for white-headed ducks was to co-author the latest account of birds of the world. And I'm only a third of 3 authors, and really most of the work there was done by Alfredo. And I would say that you may not know that the full account, if you don't have access to Birds of the World, is actually available free on ResearchGate. And I'm not going to try and summarize what we put in that document. I'm just going to today give my own personal experience working with the birds, especially in the field. And so I'm not duplicating what you can find in that account. If you're very interested in learning about the ecology of the species, then I would encourage you to also read that account. And so in terms of my own work, well, part of it, you all know about the problems with the ruddy duck hybridization. So I was involved a lot with the UK, Spain negotiations, shall we say, at the time when the Spanish were very concerned about hybridization and very keen for action to be taken in the UK. So we did the genetic work where we are actually able to show what kinds of hybrids are actually found in Spain at the time when they were being shot. So can you see my mouse when I move it around? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so basically, yeah, in terms of the genetics, you have the two parental species here and then different kinds of hybrids from several different generations amongst the birds that were collected. So we proved that the hybrids are viable, basically, which was one of the questions. And also, I'm glad to say that the control of the UK population did indeed lead to a rapid reduction in the number of ruddy ducks and the number of hybrids actually seen in Spain and collected in Spain. So that's one threat, of course, but in terms of the big threats in the east of the range at the moment, of course, the big one is habitat loss and degradation. If we think about habitat loss for white-headed duck, it's just part of the general very depressing trends that we can see in Europe and globally in terms of the loss of natural wetlands, which is on the top graph, and that's driven largely by the production of artificial wetlands, especially dams and irrigation, and also the expansion of rice culture, especially at a global level, but also in some parts of the Mediterranean. And again, this is driven by a big increase in the amount of water extraction globally and irrigation globally. And so white-headed ducks, like other species, are being affected by these trends. The dam construction in terms of the Mediterranean, I've extracted some of these figures from the very good reports of the Mediterranean Wetlands Observatory, which are available online. If you don't know them, we can see here, for example, the great increase in the capacity of dams in the Mediterranean region, watersheds, and reductions over time in the actual amount of water reaching the Mediterranean Sea from the rivers. And you can see in this map that several of the countries have very high numbers of dams, including Spain and Turkey, which are really leading to loss of wetlands, natural wetlands. So Bordeaux Lake, of course, was the most important wintering site, and we were lucky enough to work there, including Tony, and we worked there. And since then, for a month in winter, since then, the lake has continued to decline in size. And for those of you who don't know this website, it's actually very good because you can see the whole world. You can look at trends over time in water occurrence, which here we see in the red is basically the lake shrinking over time due to the water extraction from the catchment from dam construction. Of course, this kind of water extraction also leads to a growth in increase in salinity in those wetlands that are still available for birds like the white-headed duck. And we're lucky that the species has quite a high tolerance of salinity. It's very often found in saline lakes, especially in the winter, of course, and in the breeding season, it's also quite tolerant in terms of brackish wetlands, but a lower maximum salinity tolerance, of course, because the ducklings are not so resistant to high salinities. So one recommendation I would say to people in general is, at least in my experience in the past, then people often think about waterbird counts and wetland inventories, but often the data on the actual chemistry in those lakes is insufficient. So I think it's really important to do monitoring on any sites that we're interested in terms of the water chemistry, including salinity. It's an absolutely key variable that we really need to understand the value of a site for birds. So thinking about the situation in Spain, this is an old graph, I'm afraid, that I had at hand, but it doesn't make any difference really. There has been a fantastic historical success in terms of the recovery of a population on the verge of extinction in the 1970s. And these days, the numbers are much more stable. There's not a strong trend in any way. The reason for this recovery in the 80s and in the 90s was basically, in my opinion, entirely explained by protection from disturbance and particularly from hunting. And although there were some releases of captive birds, I haven't seen any evidence that that actually made any difference really to the recovery. Other people might disagree with that. And so then, of course, more or less a kind of carrying capacity was reached once the hunting was practically eliminated, and especially in the Andalusian lakes where the protection was very effective. So back in the 70s, people could shoot anywhere, basically. And of course, these birds are often on small lakes where the birds would be very accessible. And we've seen ourselves, Tony and I in Bordeaux, when we were working there, people shooting the birds and how incredibly easy it is to shoot white-headed ducks because they basically don't fly away when people start shooting. They just dive to escape the danger. And then they come back to the top and then people can shoot them. So I think it's really important to really be sure that the hunting is controlled in any key sites. And in fact, Bordeaux hunting was actually banned officially on paper when we were there, but we saw people shooting the birds. And also just comment this extremely outlier here, which many people in Spain don't actually believe, but I was there in El Hondo in Alicante, and I know those data are fairly reliable. There was an incredibly good boom year because the conditions were kind of optimal in that site at that time, but things have changed since then. I'll talk about that later. Another threat to bear in mind related to hunting, of course, and historical hunting is the lead poisoning threat. So we studied that in several papers, and clearly white-headed ducks are very sensitive to lead poisoning, quite a lot more than marble teal, for example, because that's quite typical for diving ducks. And the good thing about shooting the ruddy ducks and the hybrids that were mixed together with the white-headed ducks was they would be the black areas in the figures. So these actually give us an index of lead poisoning in birds that have not been found dead. So if you find birds dead, of course, then you're much more likely to find that they have lead shot. So actually, we were able to find, in the case of the white-headed duck, that 73% of birds overall found dead would have lead shot in them, but 20% of those that were actually shot because they're a ruddy duck or a hybrid also had ingested lead shot. So that's proof that actually these birds are very susceptible to ingesting lead shot. So I think it's really important to think about studying lead shot concentrations at key sites where the birds are present, especially if you have indications from historical data that hunting has been important and frequent in the past. So going back to the Spanish situation, this map shows the changes over time in 2 atlases, but basically really what I really want to concentrate on is just mention these 4 sites where I will refer to the special situation. I've already talked about El Hondo, and you'll see that since 2000 and 2018, then there are red dots where some sites where the birds have disappeared, as well as many blue dots where the birds were recorded for the first time. So one good example is Doñana, which is very famous, of course. So in Doñana, we have 2 main kinds of natural wetlands. We have these days a seasonal marsh, and we also have a lot of dune ponds inside the dune system. And white-headed ducks used to breed in both these systems historically, and they no longer breed in those systems. They've been forced into artificial wetlands. Of course, we've got the rice fields that are no use for white-headed ducks, but they are for marble teal, for example. We've got fish ponds, and we've got the salt ponds, solar salt works, And the fish ponds are really now the remaining habitat for the species in Doñana. And that's related again to this water extraction. So we found this graph shows the reduction in the hydro period, the number of months that a pond is actually flooded, and that's been rapidly reduced through water extraction, especially for strawberries and similar fruits. So these ponds are no longer deep, and they dry up a lot faster than in the past. And in fact, a very interesting situation where we can see with the blue dots outside the main protected area, there's actually sites who have more water than before, and actually they have a longer hydro period than before, and that's because of the irrigation outside the protected area. So in fact, some of these sites are used by white-headed duck now. And so here we have a kind of microcosm of the global situation, of the switch from natural wetlands into artificial wetlands, basically because the birds are forced to use what's left. So as I say, these fish ponds are now the main site in Doñana, and they're particularly good outside the breeding season. There's not much nesting habitat available, unfortunately. They're there because the water level is deep enough for them. It's quite stable and not particularly deep. Most of the area is less than a meter deep. So I think we must always be aware that when we find white-headed ducks, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in anything like a suitable or optimal habitat. It may be, as happened with the nene, that they're just stuck in the habitat that is left. So sometimes we might be tempted to think we need to focus on a site that's actually not really providing suitable habitat. I say that because in the Nene situation, the last birds were actually stuck in a volcanic region, and so they started to release captive birds in that habitat, which is actually not suitable, and that's why the population wasn't self-sustaining. But when people realized that they used to originally use the lowland grasslands and started to reintroduce them in those kind of habitats, then the population recovered very quickly. So I think another really important basic question is, what do these birds eat? Of course, the diet is fundamental, and really we've been able to again take great advantage of the fact that ruddy ducks and hybrids were mixed with the white-headed ducks and were being shot, to use those as a good indication of what the birds were actually eating. And so clearly this is a benthivorous species that's feeding on things at the bottom, and that's fairly obvious because of the diving behavior, but it's very important to think about what exactly they are eating. So the main two things we found in our study are the chironomids, the midge larvae, which are really important for waterfowl generally. These are the benthic larvae that they're eating, much more than the emergent insects, which are very important for ducklings of other species. We also found lots of seeds, also taken, of course, from the sediments, and but that's partly because of the bias. When you're looking at birds that have been found dead or been shot and been not stored very carefully, then basically you find that everything else is digested quite quickly. So here, this figure for seeds overstates the importance of seeds in the diet, although it's still of great interest. And then other things that live at the bottom, amphipods, isopods, for example, and in smaller numbers, wrong way, sorry. In smaller numbers, we also found other benthic organisms, which may be important in different sites. And in fact, when I went to work in Lake Vistonis and Lake Vistonida with our Greek colleagues back in the day to look at the situation in the wintering population there, I arrived saying, "Oh, I'm sure they will eat chironomids," and then we went out in the boat and we got Ekman grab, and we collected lots of samples, and all we could find were polychaetes. And then we were able to sadly recover dead birds from fishermen's nets, and then I was able to open them up using my penknife, because I wasn't expecting to have to do that, and find that they were just full of the teeth of a polychaete, worms in that coastal brackish lagoon. So I think any of these organisms that I've added on here in a certain place could be very important parts of the diet. So we were able to look at this in some detail in Bordeaux Lake in terms of the availability of food, and at that place at that time chironomid larvae were basically all there was to eat there. And so we were able to go out, or Jeff Hilton especially with our DHKD colleagues, was able to go out and do transect from the shore in different parts of the lake. And what we could see was that in areas where there were no white-headed ducks, basically the lake area was much shallower with a shallow transect from the edge of the shore, and the chironomid biomass was much lower than the sites where the birds were feeding. So in that site also we could see that they're obviously feeding at considerable depth of say at least 8 meters. So in that condition they were diving a lot deeper than they are in the Spanish sites, I know, but basically because the abundance of the food was so much higher at those depths, which isn't necessarily the case in other wetlands to find so much food at a greater depth. So in El Hondo, in Alicante, which I mentioned before, we were able to do a PhD project and do a lot of work there, both with white-headed ducks and marble teal. And those lakes I mentioned where we had a boom year, they actually, the birds there are feeding below 70 centimeters. So really it's that depth range, which is too deep for dabbling ducks. If we think that a mallard can feed by upending at about 45 centimeters, I think is about the maximum. So anything deeper than that then is available only for the diving ducks. And so this reflects the shallow depth of this lake, even though the availability would be represented by the white triangle. So most of the habitat is actually a lot shallower. And this is an interesting site because in good conditions, it's been fantastic all around the year. So that can be the case in if the management of a site is appropriate. So we looked at the habitat selection, and I'm afraid when in those days when we couldn't publish figures in color, we had this horrible black and white figure in our paper. But basically, the important message here is the kind of habitats that the birds were using in terms of the white-headed duck. Anything over 1 means selection. So they were preferring open water in the winter period in the 2 years that we were able to study. Strong selection for open water, which would basically be this habitat or anything over here, basically the open water area of the lake, whereas the marble teal would very much avoid that kind of habitat. And then when you move into the summer section where they're actually breeding, then the situation changes. There's actually selection for the other habitats being the this mixed Phragmites. This is all Phragmites, basically all we can see here. Phragmites with water. This becomes then major breeding habitat, and even more important, these channels inside the Phragmites beds were then really so highly selected. And that kind of matches up with what we found with the broods at the time, with very strong selection for those other two habitats, the mixture block of reeds, as we called it, a mixture of Phragmites and water, or these reed channels. And matched also with the vegetation associations of the species. So in this case, if we're looking at the flocks of adults during the winter and the summer, you see that the black area, that means that they're usually in open water, or if not, then associated with Phragmites. But when we look at the broods, then most of them are associated with the Phragmites. Meanwhile, marble teal are using other microhabitats with things like sedges and shallow habitats. Also, it's interesting to see how in that system there's many different ponds, and the white-headed ducks actually avoid the smallest ones. So that's what this represents, is the size of a pond and the number of birds. Marble teal actually associated with the smallest ones, and white-headed ducks with the bigger ones. So that's interesting, maybe relevant in other wetland complexes. Okay, another threat, really a big threat, water quality, is growing problems of eutrophication everywhere. And here from Doñana, we're seeing these big, very big circles represent in ridiculously high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus coming in from the streams that enter into the national park, which is a World Heritage Site. So basically, this has now been turned into a kind of filter for all the nutrients, excessive nutrients that are being coming from all the agriculture and urban areas outside. And this is a problem everywhere, I think, I'm afraid, sure in your study areas as well. Again, I think it's really important and perhaps understated in the waterbird world to find a way to look at nutrient concentrations in whatever place you're studying, because only with those data can we start to understand really what kind of management measures are needed and what might the impact be on the food supply by eutrophication. In Spain, we have a big problem with the fact that the wastewater treatment is also not great in many areas. If it's blue, it's good. If it's red, it's bad. And again, that's something that I think you can think about in many other sites, is just how well is the wastewater in the catchment being treated, and can that be improved? Because if so, I think that's a really high priority. Because eutrophication does lead to blooms of toxic algae, and also urban wastewaters clearly favour botulism, and both of those are known to kill white-headed ducks in Spain, and I'm sure elsewhere. So if you can find a way to improve treatment of any wastewater entering a site for white-headed ducks, that's a good measure. Here we have an example of Fuente de Piedra Lagoon in Spain, where they specifically produced a series of artificial ponds to treat the wastewater coming from the town. And in fact, these ponds have actually become valuable habitats for white-headed ducks as well. Because water circulation is also important. It's not just about nutrient concentration, it's also about whether the water is somehow being circulated, because if so, that also has a very positive effect on water quality. So any actions to improve water quality at key sites, I think are an important recommendation. But then invasive species, of course, a big problem. Hello?
Sorry for interrupting you. Just for you to know that we are a bit late, but since our introduction was shorter, I think that we can give you another 5 minutes, if that is okay.
Yeah, of course, 5 minutes, no problem. Okay. Yep. So, fish invasions, you know that's a major problem in the Mediterranean region. This just shows the percentage of fish species that are alien species. And where you have more alien species in any river system, then you have a higher proportion of native species that are actually globally threatened. So we have a big problem with carp, and I think other members of the cyprinid family, like Prussian carp, and we've seen that in Spain, a really big impact on white-headed ducks as well as other species. Here we're looking at Medina Lake, and we're looking at a situation where it was possible to eliminate the carp. So carp, first they arrived about 2003, and that was in a major flooding event that came in from a river, because this is naturally an isolated lake. And so then there was a crash, for example, in the amount of pondweed, potamogeton, covering the surface area, and the numbers of coots in the lake. And then the fish were eliminated, and there was a very rapid recovery in the following years, both in the amount of pondweed and the number of coots eating those pondweed. And then, unfortunately, the fish arrived again, and another instant population crash. This is a separate lake. This is Doñana Lake, and again you see the number of coots when carp are present, and then when carp were eliminated. So huge effects, and we see those. We see those also with white-headed ducks, and I'm sorry, Tony, I put pochard in here as well, because we got those also in the same figure in the paper. So again, exactly the same thing in both the same sites in Medina and Zoñar. When there's carp, then the white-headed ducks and pochard crash, and yet if they're eliminated, then the numbers recover very quickly. So management can be possible, and that's a very good thing to think about, whether it would be possible to take management. Crayfish, of course, the Procambarus originally was introduced to Doñana, unfortunately, and is now extending across the whole of Europe, and they are reputed to have effects on things like diving ducks, but the data there is not so good. I think carp are much more important when they're both present. But because of fish and crayfish introductions, I think it's important to try and avoid any kind of aquaculture project in anywhere near any of the key sites to try and prevent further arrivals of alien species. And another recommendation, as well as that, would be to realize that as temperatures increase, then the impacts of carp and other fish also increase, because their activity increases very quickly. And that's why we see greater impacts of diving ducks in southern Spain than you may see in Central Europe, for example, with the same carp species. Climate change, I think we need to think about that. I think it's really important. Of course, sea level rise is important. Think about mitigation for climate change at key sites. Unfortunately, most key sites in the Mediterranean are on the coast and therefore very threatened by sea level rise. Here you see some estimations of the amount of marsh, coastal marsh that may disappear by the end of the century. The red line means more than 70% projected to disappear. And this study also looks at inland Ramsar sites and again projects quite a big decrease in the size of Ramsar sites in inland through climate change. So we must anticipate these strong impacts coming through warming and reducing precipitation, but also be aware of the synergy with eutrophication, so that as temperature increases, the impact of those nutrients that are entering the system also gets worse, and it's easier to trigger a collapse of the system, which might involve things like expansion of lemna or azolla and toxic blooms of cyanobacteria. So we use the safe operating space concept. I think it can be a good management concept to try and take measures now to try and retain any wetland within a safe operating space. By that I mean reduce your nutrient loading or reduce the amount of water that's being extracted from the system, and that will then make the system more robust in the face of global heating especially. Also, I think we need species distribution modeling. This is an example from the lynx, which shows that the projections would be that lynx are being conserved at the moment in habitats that will not be suitable towards the end of the century. So we should also think about that with white-headed duck. So I think we need a specific species distribution model as well as possible to get a better idea about how to conserve the species in the future. We've talked for years and years about tagging somehow and looking at movements, understanding movement ecology of white-headed ducks more. I know it's extremely difficult, but it is actually underway with marble teal, for example, and we are learning a great deal about marble teal movements in the last 3 years or so. So another recommendation would be to try and do some movement ecology work with white-headed ducks. Also, if there's a plan, I don't know if anyone's still interested in captive release in Spain. Marble teal have been released massively. I would certainly say that, in my opinion, it's not an ideal solution by any means. But if there is any plan for that, then more and more reason to do genetic studies before any kind of release project, and we've been able to do that. Fortunately, recently with marble teal, we've been able to look at the genetics in great detail of populations from Spain, Iraq, and different captive populations in Europe. I think we've learned a lot about that, and we could do that also with white-headed ducks if that was deemed to be necessary. So that's it. Sorry for going a bit over time, but I hope it's been interesting, and hopefully there'll be time for questions afterwards.
Thanks a lot, Andy. That was super interesting. Congrats on the great work. I really envy all the work done in Doñana as Spanish. I never work in Spain, but I really would like to go there more often. So we will have questions and answers at the end. So please use the chat to post them. And Nikki, you are the next one.
Is it visible?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I'll go on with presenting one of my favorite species that I started my work in waterbirds and wetlands ages ago. The ferruginous duck. And see how. Oops. Okay. So diving ducks depend on healthy functioning wetlands and ecosystems. And the changes in their population can very well indicate changes in the sites that they occur, either in the water quality, aquatic vegetation, or the invertebrate populations. And as they require specific wetlands for feeding and nesting and breeding, it means that protecting these sites can help conserve a broad range of different wetland types and the associated biodiversity. And ferruginous duck is often not a very classical diving duck because very often you can spot it among the dabbling ducks. You open some studies even from the area where Andy has been working, and you would see that the ferruginous duck is usually put in a separate category along with the marble teal, away from typical diving ducks like the white-headed duck or the pochard, the common pochard. So the use of these diverse and rich habitats with different characteristics make it quite a good potential indicator, because I'll be speaking why we can use the ferruginous duck as an indicator for wetlands and conservation. So currently it is near threatened species under the IUCN Red List categories. It used to be a quite widespread species across Europe and Asia, much rarer now, with profound declines in some countries, especially in Europe. And it is its ecology and habitat requirements that make it quite a good umbrella species, and knowing its requirements could help saving quite wide range of species and habitats. So ferruginous ducks are sensitive to water level fluctuations in their habitats, and droughts, water extraction for agriculture, wetland degradation can cause significant disruption to their breeding and feeding areas. They are found typically in quite shallow freshwater lakes, ponds, marshes with abundant vegetation. They prefer quite undisturbed, slow flowing water bodies with thick reed beds, and they're quite close associated with dense aquatic vegetation, reed beds or floating vegetation like water lilies beds and other vegetation. As you can see, the upper right picture depicts a male bird in a quite big patch of Nymphoides peltata floating vegetation, typical for the breeding habitats of the species. It is quite omnivorous. It feeds on a mixed diet that includes different parts of aquatic plants, also different small invertebrates that could be insects. There are water larvae, mollusks, crustaceans, and they usually dive underwater to forage for these food resources, but they can utilize quite different methods of feeding as well, like upending, doubling, or even skimming on the surface, more like the tribes of the Anatina tribe species, the typical doubling ducks. And just to mention that many of these pictures I've included them specifically depicting quite typical breeding habitats for the species. So during the breeding season, it prefers shallow eutrophic freshwater bodies between 30 and 100 centimeters depth. It could be marshes, lakes. In many cases where these were destroyed, they use fish ponds, as we've seen in the example of Andy. These fish ponds practically replace the destroyed wetlands that the species used to breed in and live in. Already mentioned the dense aquatic vegetation, big stands of reeds or cattail or different sedges are typical for the species breeding habitats. Big expansions of floating vegetation like Nymphaeavon or Nymphoeves peltata or the different species of Potamogetum are quite typical for the species. The mosaic distribution of the vegetation within the wetland is quite important. So the mixture of open water and vegetated zones that provides both feeding opportunities and also concealment for the species during resting or nesting. So here on the pictures you see this typical mosaic distribution of the vegetation within the wetland, or mixture of small ponds, also displaying some patches of floating vegetation or quite well vegetated wetlands used by the species. Usually it would use for breeding the floating islets and reed beds. In the lower picture, there is this Srebrna lake, which is typical with these floating reed beds, where is the main breeding microhabitat for the species. And all these preferences we have looked at based on the information from the breeding population in Bulgaria, and based on the analysis, it revealed the Phrygians to prefer really well-vegetated and comparatively shallow wetlands with well-structured mosaic vegetation. Here you see the table with the parameters, and you see it's positively associated with quite higher coverage of emergent vegetation of the wetlands, preferring more shallow wetlands, not that deep ones, but favoring the mosaic distribution of the vegetation, not vegetation only along the shoreline, and floating vegetation being fairly important here. And the shallow banks that or shoreline of the wetlands that from there subsequently provide shallow mudflats where the or shallow vegetated area where the birds can feed on the benthic zoobenthic species or different water plants. So looking at microhabitat selection, sorry for the bad quality of these graphics, but they're quite old, some probably 20 years old now, or something like that. So I've looked into the selection of specific microhabitats, the different water depths areas within Srebrna Lake, which was one of my study areas during my PhD studies, and the distance from the shoreline and the distance from the emergent vegetation. So on the first graph here, you can see that the Phrygian duck, actually it's a comparison with the breeding common pochards in the same wetland. So here the solid line is the Phrygian duck, and you can see that the numbers sharply drop at certain water depth following up to after 2 meters deep depth of the water column, the numbers go down. So it clearly prefers the more shallow areas of the lake compared to the common pochard, which persists in the deeper areas as well. Quite clear is the preference closer to the shoreline, which from its side provides better feeding and resting areas for it. Most often the birds were found in the shallow areas of the wetlands, while the common pochard persisted in more evenly in further areas from the shoreline. The most clear is the distinction of the preference to the distance of the emergent vegetation, where you can clearly see how the ferruginous duck and common pochard, they clearly prefer different parts of the wetlands, the ferruginous duck being more closely associated with the emergent vegetation. And this is a graph from a factorial analysis of all these combined factors, looking into 2 different years of the study in quite dynamic environment regarding the water depth and water condition in the wetland, where here is the observations, or how the ferruginous duck selected the parts of the wetlands, being much more, keeping to the specific areas and type of microhabitats that it prefers, while the common pochard was quite a bit flexible and did adapt to the available conditions in the wetlands, which were quite much changed during the period of the study. So why indicator? We had the chance of using a long-term data for the ferruginous duck numbers, again in Srebrna Lake. And Srebrna Lake is one of the last surviving Danube riverside lakes in Bulgaria, which unfortunately now has more the characteristic of a marsh than a lake, but still one of the big wetlands on the Danube, and one of the important breeding sites for the species. At the time I did these studies, this was the best place for the ferruginous duck in the country. So from this graph at the bottom, you clearly see that it quite well correlates with the changes in the water level, which is natural about this. But this should not be taken quite in a simple manner, because the influence of the changes in the water level is also related to the disappearance of the different microhabitats selected by the species within the wetland. And they are quite important for feeding, for nesting, or for resting in the area. And thus, with a decrease of the water level, these shallow areas around in the periphery of the wetland do disappear, then the ferruginous duck has much less opportunities and much less options to select from the available microhabitats that it is associated with. The correlation between the ferruginous duck numbers and the chlorophyll A and the water transparency or turbidity, if you term it, measured by the Secchi disk. These are indication of the influence of the trophic conditions of the wetlands. So yeah, we all say that ferruginous duck does occupy eutrophic wetlands, but it has a certain tolerance, and the hyper eutrophic conditions are not something that is associated with big numbers of the Frisian duck. So potentially these high chlorophyll A concentrations correspond to big algal blooms or reduction of the oxygen and generally degradation of the wetland ecosystem that results in the decline of both plant and zoobentic food resources for the species as well. So having this in mind, the correlation between the changes, because this wetland has been monitored for quite long years, the Frisian duck numbers and population probably came up as so far the only species that clearly correlates with some of the limnology parameters of the lake changes. And time activity budgets are quite important. Andy Green touched upon this in his presentation, but they're quite often overlooked. And these are good indicators. The time activity budgets of the species within a wetland is quite good indicator. So if waterfowl species spends disproportionate amount of time feeding or flying, it may indicate food is scarce or the habitat is fragmented or there is big disturbance. Knowing where and when the birds perform key behavior helps also to identify habitat features and that must be protected or restored within this site. So unnatural shifts in the time budgets, like increased vigilance or intensive feeding or flight, can also indicate or signal the disturbance from different human activities, boating, tourism, hunting, whatever. And changes over time in the budget activities can reflect also the population health or stress due to the environmental changes. So generally, time activity studies help in designing effective conservation plans, including creation of protected parts of the lake or the whole lake, managing the water levels or controlling predators and disturbance sources. So this is quite good to keep in mind as one of the options for monitoring the activities of the species within the wetland. And here I've put, just for an example, a graph which is depicting the diurnal behavior of the Frisian duck within Srebrna Lake when the wetland conditions at the lake were practically perfect for the species, with a big deal of inactive behavior, resting, preening, whatever, taking almost half of the time. Very reasonable proportion of feeding, around 29%, and very, very little flying around in the lake. So depicting quite good condition at the time this assessment of the behavior of the species was done. Concentrations, this is, yes.
Sorry for interrupting. We are already a bit late, just for you to know.
Okay, I'm just finishing, just to touch upon, they are not often reported. There are occurring in different places. You might have big concentrations during molting period when you have big gatherings of molting males. But also there's sometimes concentrations during migration or wintering when you can see thousands of birds. These are irregularly reported or rarely reported, could be because it's irregularly occurring or there's no consistent monitoring effort across the flyways. Sorry, the wrong way. Threats, we'll have a separate webinar for threats, but yeah, Andy Green mentioned quite a lot of the threats that are also relevant to the ferruginous duck. So I won't go into the details. Thank you, and yeah, welcome any questions.
Thanks a lot, Nikki. Really interesting. You demonstrate that this was a good choice as a flagship species for waterbeds. So the next one is Tony, and please remember that we have the chat for questions and we will answer them at the end. So Tony, go ahead with the common pochard. You are mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Right. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute. I feel very honored to be amongst these speakers and also talking to a group of people that I don't get to see very much. So, so thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm not sure I'm going to tell you anything, but I think I'm coming with a completely different set of problems to what the other speakers are talking about, because
You are mute again.
I'm so sorry about that.
No worries.
I can't seem to move my my slides on. So
No.
yeah, anyway,
Yeah.
I wanted to make the point that this is rather different to the other three speakers in the sense that we're talking about a formerly incredibly abundant species that's becoming threatened. And so it really presents us with a whole series of other sort of conservation questions and issues, and I think particularly shows how bad we are at following common species on a flyway level to inform conservation when a species begins to tip from favorable conservation into unfavorable conservation status. And obviously this is particularly important, I think, for the pochard, which certainly in my childhood was a very common and familiar species. And so much so that, for instance, in the Germanic languages, pochard is called the table duck. And it's called the table duck for one very simple reason, that it was a very, very common quarry species that was very popular for eating. And that is certainly no longer the case in Denmark, where we've just recently actually taken it off the hunting list because of its very, very unfavorable status. And it's really that I want to talk about today, is to try to get at what are the conditions, what factors are actually affecting the unfavorable conservation status of this species right now. The species has a pretty much very broad distribution, in fact, in Eurasia, and it's divided into several subpopulations for monitoring and for the concept of management by Wetlands International. The global population at the moment is thought to be about 1.6 million birds, but I suspect it's probably quite a lot less than that, because there's every indication that it isn't just in Western Europe the numbers are declining. It's also very likely the case right the way throughout its breeding range. So it is clearly what I should be concentrating on, a Western European problem where the declines have been particularly dramatic, but I think it's probably the case right across the entire distribution. Now, the species is a diving duck. Unlike the ferruginous duck, I think, as Nikki showed, it much prefers deeper water. And it is, as Andy was talking about with white-headed ducks, it's very much a benthic feeder. It feeds by actually diving, propelling itself through the water column with its back legs, and then sifting generally in the sediment or taking subsurface vegetation. And although not as much a specialist of charophytes as perhaps red-crested pochard, the common pochard is well known for consuming huge amounts of these stoneworts, these calcified algae that live in shallow waters. And these species typically characterize hard water, very calcium-rich waters. They tend to be basin-rich to some extent, not necessarily. But they are typical of clear water systems. That's the most important thing, as charophytes will grow down to actually many meters of water depth but they need a water column. The same is true of things like Potamogeton. Pochard will also grub amongst the bottom substrates to take up the rhizomes and bulbils of various submerged macrophytes. But the species is also a generalist. It takes huge amounts of chironomid larvae in certain sites, certainly in studied situations in British gravel pits. This is the dominant food, and the species aggregates around the densities of this particular food item. And it will also take bivalves. These are invasive zebra mussels, and certainly in the alpine lakes of Switzerland, this is a very, very, very important source of food through the winter for overwintering pochard flocks. So you can see the bird is actually a surprising generalist. It has a range of different species that it can feed on. And this is the case pretty much through the year as well. So it's quite catholic in its diet. So there's no real reason on the surface why it should be turning from a very common and widespread species into a much more local and declining one. Now, one clue as to some of the causes behind the changes, we've been looking in Denmark for a long time at changing systems in freshwater environments. And thanks largely due to my colleague, Erik Jeppesen, who Andy has already cited many, many times in his talk today. Erik has been looking at quality changes in Danish lakes for donkey's years, and he has shown that we have big trouble here. Denmark is brilliant at producing food, there's no doubt about it, but the cost of that comes at the release of huge amounts of especially nitrates, which are applied to agricultural land, generally on sand, run straight into watercourses and ultimately into lakes. So we've had huge problems with freshwater lake systems. And Erik has been at the forefront of trying to restore a lot of these systems, which are overburdened by their nitrogen contribution from agricultural runoff. And what we see is that a lot of the eutrophic lakes, which typically pochards select for, have become hyper-eutrophicated by this addition of added nitrogen. And one of the places we've worked a lot in the last few years in conjunction with Erik and his team is this set of lakes down in southern Denmark, down here in a place called Malibu. And there are 3 lakes that you can see itemized here. And they're very important for breeding pochard. And the 3 lakes have very different systems. Rørbølle, this lake here, has actually not been overburdened with nitrogen runoff. And you can see the suspended solids, which is like a Secchi-Ditz type determination of the clarity of the water quality. You can see it hasn't changed very much. It's always been very low, which means the water quality is extremely good. And the pochard numbers breeding have always been relatively high. But in these 2 other lakes, which you can see are the much larger ones, these ones are actually very, very sensitive to the clarity of the water column. When the suspended sediments are very high, the numbers of pochard breeding are much lower than when it's very clear. And this gradient is due to a lot of the manipulation that Erik and the team have been doing, because in this period, a lot of benthic feeding fish have been fished out of these lakes in order to remove them as a factor which stirs up the sediment, releases a lot of the stored nitrogen and phosphate as well into the water column, and causes turbidity. And by removing these particular fish, what happens is you get clarity of water, the charophytes return, and that in turn brings back the pochard. So in this way, the pochard have turned out to be an extremely powerful indicator of water quality. And I think this loops back to what Andy and Nikki were saying, how important it is for us to look at the state of these freshwater bodies. What is it that's causing the changes? And how do we actually manipulate the water quality in order to restore biodiversity generally, but these particular species in particular? So to go back to the longer term trends in pochard in Western Europe, certainly as a kid, I mean, for me, pochard was a very familiar feature of our aquatic wintering waterbirds, and I've always been a great fan. I think they're gorgeous things, and certainly going back to the very beginning of counts at the Wildfowl Trust in the 1940s, you can see that numbers have increased in midwinter. But interestingly for me, the numbers increased over the same time period in, for example, September, which is like the post-breeding dispersal and immediately post-molt period, as well as in January and March. So this was a population that was in increase through the 50s and 1960s. But if you look at more recent trends, this is a trend for pochard wintering in UK. You can see numbers peaked in the mid-1950s, in the mid-1990s, and then have declined very, very rapidly ever since. That decline is mirrored also in Ireland since the mid-1990s, and also in the Netherlands as well. And if we bring all the data together from Western Europe, this Northwest Europe, Northeast Europe population flyway as defined by Wetlands International, you can see this is the trend, that the continuation of the increase after the Second World War peaked in the early 90s, and then right across the board has declined quite seriously. And although we don't have such good data from the Black Sea Mediterranean area, you can see the situation numerically is even worse, that numbers went from probably around 1 million to half of that by the early 2000s, and the numbers have not recovered there very much since. If we go further east into Southwest Asia, the trends are not very clear because we really don't have good, consistent data from there. But numbers perhaps are less affected by major increases and decreases during that period. But nevertheless, we get the impression that further east also numbers are declining a little bit in Japan as well. And certainly on the Russian breeding areas, we did an analysis recently in BirdLife, in Bird Conservation International, which showed that actually numbers were not that stable throughout much of Russia. So something's clearly happening, and I'm afraid I'm really first and foremost a population dynamics fanatic. So I tend to look at the dull side of research and ask, what's causing the decline? Is it poor breeding success? But this is where, for a common species, I'm disappointed that we're left wanting. It's very difficult, actually, to gather data on breeding success in something like a pochard long term. They breed in relatively low densities over vast areas. So it's very difficult, actually, to compile any sensible data about reproductive output. One of the ways we can do it, and have done it in the past, is to look at the age ratios amongst the shot birds in Denmark. And in Denmark, we're very fortunate that the hunters have always been very sympathetic to understanding population dynamics, and they've contributed large numbers of wings from birds that they've actually shot. And we're able to use this as a resource over time. We've got a good time series going back to the early 1980s to show the ratio of first-year birds. And you can see, although there is signs of a decline, the ratio varies enormously from year to year, and the actual trend is not significant, although the pattern does seem to be a long-term decline. But as I say, we have now banned the hunting of this species in Denmark, so this time series will not continue. So there's apparently no change amongst Danish wintering birds. And if we go to the breeding areas, this is a fantastic piece of work by Peter Mussel and Susanna and their group in Czechia, where they looked at body condition of female pochards settling to breed in fish ponds in the Czech Republic, where, if anything, the index shows a significant increase. And we know that higher body condition of nesting females is linked to larger clutch size, greater mean egg mass, and higher hatchability. So in all probability, this particular population is actually doing very well. That doesn't reflect the numbers of suitable fish ponds that there are in Czechia. It merely shows that those birds that this team is following are actually not doing so badly in terms of their body condition and likely reproductive output. So is it to do with survival? One of the interesting things about pochard, and actually to some extent about a lot of other wintering duck species, is despite the argumentative female at the top that seems to be dominating all the males, the females are at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, with the result that we know, back to this pioneering work of Chris Carbone and Mervyn Owen in the mid-1990s, that there's a very skewed sex ratio amongst pochard along their wintering distribution, where in the very south of the range you can see that there's a huge surfeit of females. It's actually a 1-to-1 ratio. But when you get up into the north of the range, much nearer to the ultimate breeding areas, then the sex ratio amongst this species is heavily skewed to males, and the males are always in dominance. And what actually Sharmila Chowdhury and Jeff Black showed was that these males actually dominate the females at feeding opportunities as well. So the females are likely to be missing out. They have to travel further down the migration corridor, and they're having to compete against higher numbers of males further up the corridor, and therefore are likely to be suffering from that sort of intra-specific competition. Now, Kane Brides and his team did a rehash of this, of the graph you can see on the left-hand side, and he actually showed that the proportion of males has actually increased down the flyway as time has gone on, but the situation up the flyway is still the same. There's a very heavy surfeit of males that are likely to dominate the feeding resources wherever you are along the wintering gradient. But we don't see strong signs of a massive decline in adult females. Again, we go back to rather historical data before the very recent years, and you can see over time there hasn't been a dramatic and certainly not a significant decline in the percent of adults that were female amongst shot birds. And we know that these shot samples are actually a reasonable assessment of what's in the field, because we also do field ratios to try and make sure that they're not overrepresented for some reason in the hunting bag, and it doesn't seem to be the case. So these ratios are reflective of what's out there in the population, we think. The problem is, again, we don't have recent data to validate whether this has continued. So what we, and the same is true also in the Finnish, in Finland. We also know that this is something that Hannu Poisa published not so long ago, where there has been no major change in the proportion of adult females returning to the breeding areas. The only evidence we do have is from recent French, Swiss, and British studies, which do very clearly show, as you can see, this is the time series from the French data, and you can also see in the Swiss and British data that males have higher survival rate than do females. And this is very normal for most duck species. We know this to be the case. It's inferred, it's hypothesized to be to do with obviously the fact that the females have to sit and brood and raise their young, and that puts them closer to risk of predation, and therefore it's likely that this contributes to the skewed survival rate. But there's no real clear of a long-term change in survival. But again, these are local studies. They're done on rather a small scale, and what we're missing really is some joined up thinking right across the flyway. The other thing that I think we haven't thought about so much is the possibility of changing immigration-emigration. One of the extraordinary things about the distribution of birds ringed or recovered in Britain is that amongst pochard, a huge numbers of birds come from central continental Eurasia. And this really is extraordinary. This is nothing like any other diving duck or indeed dabbling duck distribution at all. That here right across in the west of Europe, this little island is receiving huge numbers of birds from way, way back into the continent. And if we look even further, you can see that some of these birds come right across from the far east of Russia. And so it looks like there's much more panmixia of these birds wintering in the far west amongst pochard than there are of many other species. We've never had widgeon so far recovered so far east from Britain. So I wonder if there's always been a huge contribution of birds from continental Eurasia to Western Europe, about which we're not aware, and how much that changes, especially now, as Andy showed, there's drought in these central Eurasian areas a lot. There's also a lot of eutrophication going on in these areas. And I just wonder if this is a huge source sink population where the source is literally beginning to dry up as these central Eurasian wetlands are becoming smaller and potentially much more salt and also potentially much more eutrophicated. Anyway, that's our hypothesis. I'm just throwing that out. We don't know anything about it. We urgently need some flyway studies of this species. But a few years ago, we started this. We started to initiate this sort of process by trying to ask experts, well, what's the decline? We asked folk in 17 different countries, what did they think was the cause of problems? And this was the table, which you can find in Wildfowl. This is easily accessible. Everybody was agreed that the cause of the increase in pochard through the post-war periods until relatively recently was the creation of reservoirs, fish ponds, and or gravel pits right across Western Europe and parts of Central Europe. Certainly post-war, there were huge numbers of fish ponds, particularly in Eastern Europe, supplying basically part of the Soviet Union, but also their own public, with fresh and simple protein. And this is a favored habitat of breeding pochards. And so it's probably no wonder that the population expanded as this new source of food came on stream. So that was amongst the favorites for causing the increase. Ironically, a continuation in the eutrophication associated with these wetlands as a result of agricultural runoff right across Western Europe was cited as the cause of the decline, as we see more and more fresh, clean, clear water, hyper-eutrophic systems becoming even more eutrophic and becoming basically turbid mess with very little in the way of submerged macrophytes and certainly a very poor infauna in the substrates underneath. A lot of correspondence also highlighted loss of black-headed gull colonies. As black-headed gulls have become rarer and rarer across continental Europe, their big nesting colonies, which provided a protective umbrella against predation for a lot of pochard, have disappeared, and with them the pochard that bred at these sites. So even if the aquatic system is still suitable for raising pochard young, the lack of this protective curtain that's provided by colonies was considered a major contribution to the disappearance of pochard. And again, there's lots of evidence of even where pochard continue to breed, they do so less well in the absence of colonies than they do where they are. Now I have a problem because this is behind your beautiful faces, so I can't see. The other thing that was highlighted was the American mink predation problem. American mink, especially in Northern Europe, has become a huge problem and is a predator of especially eggs, but will take pochard adult females as well. And then in very recent years, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, in places like the Baltic states, in Poland, even in Eastern Germany, a lot of the traditional fish ponds have been abandoned, with the result that habitat that used to be there has now become literally dry habitat. It just simply doesn't exist anymore. So that's another contribution, simple straight loss of habitat. And in other cases, as is the case in Czechia, as Peter Musil confirms, that there's been an intensification of fish pond management where more and more manure, more and more grain, more and more food is put in to increase the yields of fish, particularly carp from these fish ponds, has resulted again in hyper-eutrophication of a lot of these systems, making them unsuitable for the pochard. But you can hear what is the decline.
Sorry.
Nearly finished. We honestly
okay,
don't
perfect.
know. No clear evidence for changes in reproductive output or adult survival. But we really lack good monitoring of both. So this is where we do need lots more joined up thinking. It's not good enough just to count birds. We need to know what's driving the counts. It seems very likely that hypereutrophication has damaged the food supply and that predation is a big issue. Pochard was said to have been traditionally a bird of the Central European steppes and were actually absent from most of Europe prior to the 1800s. And it was also said that drought in this region actually pressed birds westward. It colonized all of Scandinavia and to Netherlands, Britain, all over the continent. And since the Second World War has increased substantially. So it may be that it was forced out of Central Eurasia in previous times by drought. And that could be happening again, with the result that there's just simply not a surfeit of birds coming from that area to us now across Western Europe. There's no doubt that the creation of habitat created huge amounts of breeding habitat for the birds for a period, but with increased fertilizer and habitat loss, as I've described, you may well be that we're losing the very habitat that was so suitable for them after a few years of optimal conditions. And as I say, it may well be that we're now missing emigrants from further east, which supplemented our own birds and therefore the decline. So meantime, Pochard's been removed from the Danish hunting list. And this is a classic case, I'm afraid, of a researcher saying more research is needed. But we can see that taking the bird off the huntable list is going to increase survival and should be something we consider across Europe in the first instance. Anyway, I'm sorry to have gone on a bit long. My great thanks to the many Pochard freaks who have contributed to this, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tony. It was really interesting. And yeah, we need to be really careful when a bird is called common and it's not common anymore. You're right. So questions at the end, and then the next one is Omran. He's going to talk about diving ducks.
Hello, everyone. I will share my presentation immediately, and I promise it will be a shorter one. It's clear? Okay. It's Omran. I'm a biologist who is working on the ecology and conservation of the white-headed duck in the Turkey, especially in the eastern part of the Turkey. And thank you for inviting me to this amazing webinar among these amazing speakers. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Omran. I think the sound is not really good. Can you go closer to the mic or?
Can you hear?
Yeah, now it's
more
better.
clear? Okay.
Yes.
I think I need to be very high-low. I'm a part of the nature conservation NGO in Turkey. It's named Nature Research Society. And here's some study area subjects and target species and habitats from us. What we do in the tree monitoring here for the tree diving ducks in Turkey, actually 4 years for the white-headed ducks, 2 years for the other 2 IT species. First of all, we do the wintering studies. We started the winter count in November to cover the early wintering moments of the bite.
Can you keep the mic close to your mouth? I think that when you are moving, the mic goes far away.
Okay. Can you hear clearly?
That's perfect.
Okay. Sorry. We start wintering counts in November to cover the early wintering moments of the white-headed duck and continued in December and January. It was important to prioritize the survey areas since the Turkey, has a very large territory and our team consisted of only 3 researchers. To do this, we used the literature sources, the country most widely used bird database, eBird, midwinter waterfall count reports, and expert opinions, of course, to identify priority sites. Then we After the winter surveys, we conducted breeding surveys in both early and the late breeding seasons. There were two main reasons for this distinction. First, to understand the threats in suitable breeding habitats where the species was present early in the season, but no breeding was recorded later on later breeding season. Second, because late breeding surveys are essential for the white-headed ducks because it's a late breeder in the especially eastern Anatolian part of the Turkey. To select the breeding sites, we use data from the breeding bird atlas, scientific literature sources, and also we study on the Google Earth to trying to find out which suitable habitats for white-headed duck because it's a partially cryptic species for Turkish researchers. Here's on the map. You can see the green cities which we study on the wetlands in these cities. The bottom maps with the wintering ones on the left, the breeding ones on the right, and the spots show the study areas on the map. Results. During the first breeding period, numbers were relatively low for the white-headed ducks and also Ferrugian duck. However, in the second wintering period, we record a significant peak in November with over 4,000 individuals of white-headed duck. More than 3,000 individual was recorded in only one area in Eastern Anatolia, again, named Lake Arin and alkaline wetlands in Eastern Anatolia. The common pochard had the highest overall numbers in both winters, while the Ferrugian duck showed a steady much more lower presence. Here's the main wintering areas of the three species. White-headed ducks is the most limited ones among these three diving species. Here's the breeding results. Of course, we have found only a small part of the common pochard, and I'm sure it's also a small part of the Ferrugian duck because Turkey is a quite large territory, and trying to find out all of the breeding pairs nearly impossible, actually. But we have currently more specific results for the white-headed duck population in the breeding season. Here is the common pochard's breeding range in the Turkey. It's focused mainly Marmara region close to Balkans and central Anatolia and of course eastern Anatolian part. Here is the Ferrugian duck's breeding range in Turkey, very similar to the common pochard, but very less than the common pochard also. Here is the white-headed duck breeding range in Turkey. We have two distinct geographical range for the white-headed duck. One of them, the central Anatolia, but a very small part at the same time for the white-headed. But we have the majority portion of the breeding population of the white-headed duck is located in the eastern Anatolia. Here's some typical breeding habitat for the Ferrugian duck and common pochard. As you have seen before me in the presentations, they are typical habitats for Turkey again. But white-headed duck is very unusual. Has a very unusual breeding habitat in Turkey. Very fragmented, very small, and very shallow. Some brackish, salty, and freshwater mixed areas, especially in the eastern Anatolia. Here is some maps. We put all the data from the different year range for each species and show the all breeding range and wintering distribution and native distribution with green. When comparing these maps with the results of this study, a clear construction in the breeding range of all three species becomes very narrower in these days. As a discussion, no comprehensive nationwide survey had previously been conducted for the two ITS species in Turkey. It's likely that both ITS species are breeding in higher numbers than we are able to detect because of, again, the size of the Turkey and the small size of our research team, unfortunately. Conducting the country, this survey, it's very hard actually, because especially for the Persian stock, because it's a very cryptic breeding behavior in Turkey, and most of the pairs were undetectable within the dense reed base. Maybe it will be more possible with the drone technology in the near future in Turkey. The highest estimate of the breeding pairs of the white ducks was in 1996, with between the 200 and 250 pairs by Hughes et al. After this study, Gürsoy again estimated the breeding pairs between the 80 and 125. And this study, the current one, suggests an approximate 70% decline in the number of the breeding white-headed ducks pairs over the past 28 years. It's a very shortened time period, actually, for this dramatic decline in Turkey. As for the wintering numbers, a nearly 90% decline may have occurred in Western Anatolia. It should be noted that when we have this data, we don't have the data on the Eastern Anatolian part of the Turkey. The greatest unknown is the migration of the white-headed duck. So we need the rapid action to this diving duck to conserve, and the new migration stopover studies for well-designed global scale conservation strategies. We definitely need to know the migration routes and the stopover behaviors of the white-headed duck. So we collect the population data for all three diving species and also two others, but unfortunately we have lost the breeding population for these other two species already in Turkey. Some threats from Turkey against the diving ducks. Then we collect the data after the threat analysis. We published a multi-species action plan for 5 duck species in Turkey. If you would like to check this one, I can share with you also after this webinar. So thank you for your time and attention, and also apologies for my English level because I'm not a fluent speaker. Thank you for patience. And I would like to, at this note, please feel free to get in touch today or in the near future to us, because we are very open and ready to form a boat run to save for the ducks. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Omran, and congrats on the action plans. No worries about the English. We are not British here also.
Thank you.
So yeah, we have 20 minutes of questions and answers. We have no questions on the chat. So feel free to open your mics, and Nikki and Wim will moderate this session if you need something.
Well, maybe I'll start, even though I'm one of the speakers. I was just wondering, when Tony highlighted the decline in black-headed gull colonies, how that fits in. I mean, do we really know why they are declining? Is it just supposed to be generic increase in predation pressure over such a large geographical scale, or why is that happening? Because I'm working on black-headed gulls now here in Spain, and here we actually, historically, you see, well, they hardly seem to have been breeding in Doñana, and the numbers have increased since the creation of fish ponds because they've got better breeding habitat. And also in Morocco, they seem to be starting to breed in recent years. So what's going on with black-headed gulls? I know it's a species that, if we look at birds of the world, it's surprisingly poor and short, the account. So there doesn't seem to be that many people working with that species either. who really understand what's going on. What do you think?
Tony?
Tony, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, the reasons are many and varied. For instance, in Latvia, there have been several huge colonies abandoned because they were associated with fish farms where there was a huge amount of fish waste that was free food for them. In Denmark, the change from spring sown cereal to autumn sown cereal has had a massive effect because classically here, the birds used to follow the tractors on the plows and take invertebrates. So I think, you know, every country will come with a different explanation. Certainly in Finland, a lot of population retraction has happened because of both mink and raccoon dogs, which are now predating black-headed gulls and making them even abandon island nesting colonies. So, you know, I think there's a recipe for, there's a different explanation almost for every colony, but it's like, it's a typical salami effect. You know, there's a different cut that's affecting different colonies across the continent. And the net effect is all these other species, including pochard and probably some of the other species, are actually losing out from this protective umbrella. So it's a very interesting, so it is an umbrella species, obviously, that's disappearing. And the other ironic thing is that we've just been looking in Denmark. We've got a project, I'm just writing up literally now, where we showed that actually restoration of sites, we have lots of new created wetlands in Denmark where we've designed islands specifically for black-headed gull colonies, and they're actually taking them up in spades. I mean, they everywhere you create somewhere, they come in, which rather implies that actually nesting sites might be limiting. So, you know, there's all sorts of explanations. I can't come with one, you know, global explanation, but there's no doubt there's been massive decline in black-headed gull colonies, which is having a knock-on effect.
Thanks. Yeah, I think in Doñana, certainly nest site limitation is the reason why they've increased.
If I can just add to that also, avian flu, I mean, it's one of the species which is heavily hit in some of the ways of avian flu, especially some of the last ones, even in Central Europe, Czech Republic, countries there, but also the Baltic states, some of the populations are almost wiped out. I mean, it has the, and I think a bit more historically, like 15, 20 years ago, I think the closure of all the waste dumps in especially Western Europe has contributed certainly to the wintering. I remember on my local birding spot, roosting sites in winter of, if it was a bit cold, like 120,000 birds. If you get 2,000 now, it's a lot because there are no garbage dumps anymore opened. So maybe that's less the case in Morocco and parts of Spain still. But certainly in Northwest Europe, that must have contributed massively to the wintering of the species. And as Tony said, I think the colonies, the big colonies, seem to have gone, and they're now more spread out, a bit like the cormorant. Yep. We see it with the cormorant as well. So maybe there is, well, certainly further studies to be done, but some forms of predation are probably causing them to spread out and try to breed wherever they can on sometimes really strange places as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting. Although, just to note, we know that it's much more reliant on wastewater treatment plants than other gulls. So, yeah, it uses landfills, but at least down here in the south, it's the wastewater treatment plants that are the main wintering habitat in comparison. So that's probably true elsewhere, I guess, as well.
Any more questions? Please raise your hands. Yes, Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel guilty because I'm a speaker as well, and I shouldn't dominate this, but I'm very curious. Both Nikki and maybe Well, and maybe Andy as well. One of the things that struck me was that in Denmark we're creating all these what we call engsø meadow lakes, which we use to mop up nitrogen which is coming down the rivers. It's something we started in the 80s and 90s, and which we've continued through as a way of cleaning our watercourses, cleaning the lakes, and ultimately inshore waters to stop all this nitrate coming out. It's a very bad solution. We should not be putting nitrogen on it in so much amounts, but that's another issue. That's what we've done. And these places have turned out to be fantastic. It struck me, Nikki, your Faruganastok sites look like perfect shallow water lakes that you could actually quite easily create. Meanwhile, that fantastic white-headed duck site that you showed with the two-lane motorway that we've talked about, I know, you and me, that looks like a picked off part of a lakeside caused by the road. Could we create lots of these like microsites to attract these species? Because we do know a little bit about what drives those two species, I think. Is there a possibility to create habitat, do you think, or is this naive and stupid?
If I can take the first go. Actually, yes. We've been talking quite some long time ago now with Bascus exactly this, because we talked, we know what the species wants and likes, and these are easily created wetlands. And we've seen it with some of the restoration efforts in Bulgaria. When you reflood these wetlands, the species is very easily and quickly returning when they start functioning properly. So practically, if you create these type of wetlands, they can occupy them quite easily. And something we always thought, well, we always discuss it, whether it's eutrophic, but also those dense reed beds, they purify quite a lot of the water.
Exactly.
So yeah, you have quite good quality wetlands at the end, especially when they're that well vegetated. But creating these habitats can easily attract the birds back. That's my experience, I would say.
Because the other thing, Andy, is that you had a lot of blue dots really in the center of Spain for white-headed duck, in an area where I'd assume that drought was causing less and less habitat. So were they created habitats as well?
Some of them, yeah, but again, it's here the water shortage and the fact that water supply is so unpredictable, dynamic is a real limiting factor in terms of promoting new restoration projects along the lines that you were saying. For example, in Doñana, I've been arguing for something similar, but the reality is that when you've got so many drought years when there's hardly any water to play around with, then it's no longer so viable to come up with that kind of idea, because then by the time you've treated the water, there's nothing left at all. So the water never ends up entering your final destination, you know. But yeah, there's a lot of those sites actually related to using wastewaters that are then pumped into a natural lake bed and leaving increasing depth and increasing the hydro period of some of those sites. And I must say, I think of some of the other blue dots are related to increased monitoring effort, really. So it's not such a widespread increase as that figure suggests, in my opinion.
You know, it's just that there's so much pressure at the moment to, there's also going to be funding, obviously, to restoration of habitats. It strikes me if we can couch these in like multifunctional wetlands, where you're not necessarily just doing it for threatened species, but also potentially, like you say, for cleaning up wastewater. You know, surely we can get some sort of synergy from all these potential sources of money, and and actions.
I think Omral wants to say something.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Tony, thank you for your question. I believe we can do it in Turkey. Because of this, I included the physical chemical properties of the water in the breeding sites, also chlorophyll A and suspended soils, solids, and potential diet in my PhD study. If we find the sufficient economic and opportunity, we want to trade in Turkey. So I think we can do it.
Excellent.
If I can add something, because I had the chance to go along with Omral visiting the Eastern Anatolia breeding sites, and what I saw there, and there were all 3 species occurring there, most of the wetlands, practically all, were in very poor shape. And there was quite intensive agriculture with irrigation, pumping out groundwater for irrigation. And the colleagues there told me that these were the better sites compared to what's found in central Anatolia. And some of them were pretty bad shape, very tiny places, and especially the marsh near Van Lake, it's being slowly devastated and shrinking more and more every year, with new roads being built and cutting off pieces. And this was the best breeding site that we found.
Yeah, it seems dramatic, but it's true. Very degraded sites are the breeding sites for the white-headed ducks.
Can I just add something more general, because I think we're almost coming to the end. I guess a lot of you know that the European Commission has issued a tender for a number of organizations to work on situation analysis and adaptive harvest models for a number of huntable species, including pochard. Part of this work of the consortium is also to identify key actions on the non-hunting. So one actions linked to size, but also like the invasive alien species and other threats. So I guess you're all aware of that. But if not, we will put it in the email with a link to the recording, because one of the important actions that was mentioned there was to identify, like within Natura 2000 sites, core areas within a site to reduce the disturbance of hunting and all other disturbance factors. I haven't, if I remember correctly, seen it mentioned a lot in the presentations, disturbance, but do you think that could be an important element for some of the reasons of the decline for the different species, these levels of disturbance? Thanks.
Maybe I could answer that. I mean, I think it's not such an issue as with dabbling ducks. I don't think, where if somebody goes out on a punt or is shooting on a flight line, it can be actually very disturbing. A lot of the situations where people hunt or used to hunt pochard in Denmark, I think they go out and they maybe get 1 or 2 birds and they're gone forever. But I know we discussed it in under that project. It was considered an issue, but I'm not up to spin enough about how people shoot them, for instance, in Germany or Poland or Italy, to know how that actually impacts pochard. But I know it was something we discussed a lot, about having like disturbance-free refuges in areas where you could shoot from boats, for instance.
I think also a bit wider. I think post-COVID in many countries, people go more out, at least in some countries in Western Europe.
Yeah.
And you also see them doing a lot of activities. I know of sites which were relatively quiet before, and now everybody thinks they can do anything on water, from drones, these parapaint flying, airplanes, helicopters, going on the water with everything you can think about. So it was more a bit broad. I think these type of disturbances in areas close to where humans live, and where is that not these days? Do you see any signs that's an increasing threat for these diving species, or not in particular?
Not from my angle, I don't think. I didn't explain it so well, but I mean, I think if you look at the changes, big decline, for example, in London, Alicante, that's much more connected with increase in fish populations and increase in nutrient inputs. And I don't think the white-headed duck is relatively sensitive to disturbance. And certainly the sites that are occupied are protected from general disturbance quite well in Spain, I think. Not necessarily from hunting disturbance, from other kinds of disturbance, then yes, well protected.
Okay, thank you.
I think that it might differ from country to country. And in case of wintering areas, I've seen evidence of disturbance by flying drones, now that you mention it specifically, with people coming in protected area along the Black Sea coasts and flying drones low enough to flush diving ducks. The case was mixed tufted ducks and common pochers, but yeah, nowadays more and more people tend to use drones for making pictures or videos, and yeah, flushing ducks on water might be one of the options to get more attractive stuff. So, and it's not regulated in any way in Bulgaria, especially.
Thank you.
No more questions. I think that we need to close the webinar. We just have one comment on the chat from Fred, as a good IBA KBA officer from Africa, reminder us that all this information on threats, they can really help us on the monitoring assessment of the IBAs and KBAs. And then just to share that we will share this recording with you on an email. And thanks to all of the speakers. Thank you all for joining. And just a reminder that this is the beginning of a series of webinars. So stay tuned and see you next time.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Okay, have a great
Thank
day,
you very
everybody.
much. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.